Yes. Good morning or good afternoon to all of us. It sounds like a very formal meeting, but de facto this is really just for our big audience out there. We usually record them, so that's why we use the microphones. And the Forest Technical Network, of which this is a part, is really meant to connect headquarters staff with staff that we have in regional offices and sub-regional offices and country offices who can link in to learn live if you want and interact live, or then see the video. Hence, if we have a presentation, if you can just click this button with this red light, that would enable us for you to be accessible and your expertise also in the future. I just learned that we have the most fantastic group here in the room that we have been collecting possibly for quite some time on fire. So I'm really glad to see you all here to discuss that very important topic. The Forest Technical Network, as very briefly said, is a network to enable information to travel very quickly from places like this in the headquarters of FAO to our offices wherever they are. There might be a few that are online. You can link in now from your desk. So don't be deceived by the number of people here necessarily. I happen to have the pleasure to lead the Forest Technical Network. My name is Ewald Damenstein. I'm the Deputy Director of the Forestry Department. And as such, my role is mostly to just give this type of introduction and then hand over to the knowledgeable guys left and right from my office. So it's a very comfortable position. Also, I'm sitting in the middle now. With that, I'm not sure whether there is anything else that is needed from my side before you take over, Peter. Other than saying it's great to have you here. I understand that you will be here for several hours or days to discuss a topic that couldn't be more actual, really. I can't remember whether we had so much media coverage on Siberia and Sumatra and Amazon. Not so much about Botswana or Africa, which is just as sort of important than this year. It was just really a series of high-profile fires. I was in Kuala Lumpur, I believe, last week, 1.5 weeks ago, and you could see the haze, yes, because you couldn't see the buildings just a couple of blocks away from the Sumatra and Borneo fires. So there is a lot of importance to move forward on that topic, and it's a very important meeting that we have, trying to use the technologies to prevent fires in many cases, or managing fires in a different way before they hit the news as big as they do. There is always a bit of a potential in a crisis, meaning that potentially we get things done because there is so much attention now, which might be good in the long run for us. But with that, I really hand over to you, Peter. Thanks for making this possible and bringing people here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ewald. Just to introduce myself, I'm Peter Moore, the Forest Officer, Fire Management and Disaster Risk Reduction in FAO. Thank you very much, Ewald. This FTN, this broadcast comes about because we're taking advantage of the International Savanna Fire Management Initiative people who are in Rome for another meeting. And so the idea was to have a look at something that is functional, that's been operational, that's been in place for a number of times, and in particular look at the piloting of that in Botswana, which FAO is involved with on the technical committee. Why are we interested in that? A couple of reasons. The key ones are that it's community focused and indigenous people focused, and that's obviously a major thing that we need to think about and work on. 90% of fires are caused by people, which means that 90% of fires are caused at the local level. So we need to be working with the people at the local level. As with FAO, within FAO we have other people working on fires and remote sensing, and I've been pushing and developing a concept about a dashboard so that the developing countries we partner with and that we work with can go to a website and find out something about their fire history, numbers, area burned, what was burnt, and so on. And so this presentation today is about something that is in that direction and is already working in that way. So we have 3 speakers today. We have Catherine, who will give a broad overview, Catherine Monagle, Jeremy Russel-Smith, who will then talk about the project more specifically, and then I think Peter will talk about the MRV, in other words, the measurement side of things. All 3 of these people are from Australia. This isn't a mafia-connected thing. It just happens that Australians have been working on savannas and fires in their north for probably 30 or 40 years, Jeremy. Yeah.
About 30.
30, okay, for 30 years, and it's worth taking advantage of that history and that expertise. So, Catherine, thank you very much. And,
Thank you, Peter. As Peter mentioned, my name's Catherine Monagle, and I am Australian, but I'm also an honorary Italian. I live in Turin in the north, and I've been working before with the United Nations University for a number of years. Since this initiative began, it actually sprang out of the United Nations University Traditional Knowledge Initiative, and since then has become more and more focused on this very specific issue of indigenous fire management, drawing from the Australian experience. So what I will do today, I'm just going to give a general introduction both to our initiative and the story of how it came about and what we hope that its impact will be in the future. As Peter mentioned, then I'll hand over to Jeremy and Peter Jacklin, who'll talk more about our recent experience in Botswana and the science that underpins our work. And then hopefully people will have some questions and we can have a more general discussion about some of the issues that might arise. So as I mentioned, we came about because of something that happened in the field. There was a great deal of experience in the north of Australia about in drawing from a very long history of indigenous fire management, where the people in the north of Australia used fire for many, many different reasons, for food security, for cultural expression, and the landscape was very much dependent on cultural fires. As in a number of countries around the world, histories of colonialisation meant that the indigenous peoples were displaced from their traditional lands and the fires stopped. This led to a regime of fire that moved from the traditional practices which focused in the early dry season, when the fires are very low intensity and they can be more easily contained, to more and more wildfire in the late dry season, which burns at a much higher intensity and can be more catastrophic for biodiversity as well as for people. The work that Jeremy and co have done in the north of Australia has really attempted to really look at what the traditional practices were and build this with a modern scientific methodology that would quantify those emissions and provide a basis for us to be able to understand, if you burn in the early dry season, as so much of the traditional practice focused on, what are the emissions savings from that as opposed to letting these catastrophic wildfires take place? Jeremy's team was able to prepare a methodology which quantified those emission savings. Making that methodology mean something in practice to be able to actually measure the emissions also requires a monitoring, reporting and verification system based on satellite technology, which Peter will talk more about. The other thing that happened around this time was the Australian government's Emissions Reductions Fund, which meant that Indigenous and fire management projects, as well as those on other types of land tenures, for example on pastoral lands, projects could be developed whereby the people were able to institute early dry season burning and measure the emissions savings from those projects and be accredited in this Emissions Reductions Fund where they could actually get carbon abatements in effect. for the emission savings that they were generating by moving to an early dry season burning regime. I won't talk much about that because these are the experts to my left, and they can talk in depth about the science and the MRV systems. So the potential of emission savings from these projects is significant, somewhere in the range of 30 to 50% in the areas that these projects are run. There's also demonstrated, protection of biodiversity. The type of protection that it affords to biodiversity varies according to the different types of ecosystems that are affected. Basic biodiversity, as well as things like protection of fire-sensitive microhabitats within other areas, are also possible. But very importantly, these projects have led to significant benefits for the participating indigenous communities. So we've gone from a social context in which remote indigenous community members would leave their country to head to big population centres, big problems with alcohol, lack of employment, and children having to leave their communities if they wanted to get an education. These projects have really transformed some communities. For example, in West Arnhem Land, there is the opportunity now for primary school students to stay in communities. There's more than 200 jobs for Indigenous community members across the north of Australia, and many of these projects are also community owned and led, so the economic benefits flow back and are reinvested in communities and community infrastructure. This is an example which Jeremy will no doubt talk further about. On the left, you see this Western Arnhem Land project. Before fires were managed according to these methodologies, you can see that there was a great extent and intensity of fires from the late dry season burning. On the right-hand side, you take it forward 4 years, and you see that the fire picture has significantly changed. That the extent of fire is reduced and the intensity reduced, and on the bottom photo you see the different pictures of how the landscape is looking under those various regimes. The methodology I mentioned, I'm not going to go into this at all, it's just to show you that there's a big equation behind the methodology, of which I'm not qualified to speak at all. So any questions about the emissions calculations, direct to Jeremy and Peter. So we have gone from a situation in which much of the north of Australia was subject to intense wildfires in the late dry season, to just a couple of projects which trialled the application of these methodologies, now to more than 75 projects across the north of Australia, of which 25 are Indigenous owned or have some involvement in the structure of the project. So that's really changed the fire landscape of Northern Australia. This picture here, I mean, to sum up, this project has enormous benefits because it has emission savings, it protects biodiversity, and it transforms both the lives of communities and individuals within communities. This picture here, I don't know if some of you read the Guardian newspaper, this was just an article from a couple of weeks ago. This is a female ranger from the Kimberley region of North Australia. She is now working as a fire ranger, and she basically was the spokesperson for most of this article about the transformational impact that these projects had had on both her fellow rangers and her community. So if you get a chance, I can also send the link for that article to your network. And so she's a great spokesperson. Then we thought, okay, so from a United Nations university perspective, and as these scientists had been asking and hinting for many years, we thought, well, can this methodology be applicable in other regions and generate similar benefits in other regions of the world, knowing that many landscapes and many fire problems are very similar across the savannas and the tropical dry forests of the world. Here's just a summary of the global impact of wildfires, particularly in savannas, which makes up 1/6 of the global land surface. 65% of biomass burning comes from savanna, and still a significant proportion of these savanna landscapes are under some form of traditional communal land tenure. In terms of the emissions contribution of wildfire in these regions, there's around about a net 2 gigaton carbon dioxide equivalent contribution, and Jeremy will talk more about the emissions picture. Wildfire also has a great human cost. It kills people. It also creates great damage to infrastructure. And in 2017, insured losses from wildfires were more than $14 billion US. So it's not an insignificant economic problem, to say the least. From understanding that general global picture, we asked in the first phase of the International Savanna Fire Management Initiative, how can we actually prove that from these hints that actually it could be feasible across the globe? So from within the United Nations University, we undertook a 3-year program that had 3 components. The first part was sharing the Australian experience. So we aimed to really just engage with a few other communities in savanna landscapes and other people doing fire work across the world. So, for example, we had exchanges from Brazil to Australia, which Anya Hoffman, who just walked in a little while ago, and I went up to Arnhem Land and took a whole bunch of Brazilian officials to see the Wildfire Project and also to the Kimberley. Some of us also went to Namibia to learn more about the situation on the ground in Namibia and to meet some communities and see how fire was managed in the Caprivi in the northwest of Namibia. We also more formally started to engage with governments and other stakeholders in the regions, and we had regional workshops in Africa and Asia, and we undertook a more research-based global feasibility assessment. And we also just generally established a global community of practitioners which continues and is becoming more formalised, and started to develop a toolkit of indigenous fire management related resources. These are just a couple of pictures. There's a picture of Botswana on the left. On the right you see us taking, this is on the right you see Dean Nyibabuk and Nigel Galla from West Arnhem Land. These are Indigenous elders and community fire rangers, together with one of the rangers from the northeast of Namibia. This is on our Namibian Learning Exchange. So that was 2 weeks in the wilds of Namibia, and that was a fantastic experience. The Indigenous rangers talking to the Indigenous San elders about their fire histories and how them discovering how much in common they had was fantastic. Here you see on the left, this is a photo of the regional meeting that we had in Indonesia. And then on the right in Namibia with delegates from all over Southern Africa, so countries such as Zimbabwe, Angola, Zambia, Mozambique, Namibia, Botswana and South Africa were present. As part of the research component, Jeremy and I and some others from South America and Southern Africa got together to publish an article in the journal Climatic Change, and that's just one of the many, many scientific articles written by this team on this issue, as well as others working on this issue around the world. And finally, at the UNFCCC meeting in 2015, we launched the results of our global feasibility assessment, which looked at 3 different regions and examined the potential applicability of something similar to the Australian experience in those regions. And that was launched by the Australian government, who are also sponsoring this second phase of the initiative. And basically we showed that methodology-based Indigenous fire management was applicable more or less across the savannas and the tropical dry forests of the world. And we also note that while the methodology might be not quite so applicable in these other regions, across places even like the Arctic, California, Siberia, many indigenous peoples around the world have some kind of traditional fire practice, and that's something that we would like to examine in future. So now we move to the second phase of the initiative, which started in 2018. And we went from, in the first phase, establishing global applicability to moving on to proof of concept activities in the field. We have started some pilot projects in Botswana, which Jeremy will talk more about. The first one that we're looking at is the Sedilo Hills, which is a World Heritage area in northern Botswana. Then there's the Chobe region and the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, which will become the subject of research in the near future. So far, we've had an inception meeting in Botswana. We've signed an MOU with the government of Botswana, and we've had community consultations with the San people in the Sedilo Hills region. The type of activities that you need to get an Indigenous fire management project off the ground are quite substantial and require quite a lot of external input in the initial phase before projects can more and more become Indigenous owned and led over time. So you have things like, first of all, the establishment of free, prior and informed consent with the Indigenous communities. Of course, that's a cornerstone, central principle of the project. And we don't see that obviously as a one-off activity. That's something that has to always be a focus. We are undertaking a pilot site law and governance assessment because, of course, in any location you go to, there are issues around land tenure, also who owns carbon, all sorts of issues like that that have to be evaluated. The government also has to issue the necessary consents and licenses for managed burning. There's legal advice in regards to the structure of projects, how are they housed legally as corporations or within customary governance systems, all of those types of issues. On the scientific front, you have to do a baseline fire review and need to prepare a validated vegetation fuel map. There needs to be a way for satellite technology to measure the emission savings, which is a big task. The methodology has to be developed based on the local fire history and vegetation patterns. And there has to be a fire management operations plan. There has to be community capacity building. It has to reflect the local traditional knowledge and be coherent with the way that the Indigenous communities wish to manage fire according to their own cultural practice. And there also has to be environmental and social impact assessments. So we're not talking about an insignificant project, and it's one that's truly interdisciplinary and has to be seen as really a 3 to 10 year project in any given location. In order to progress this in Botswana, we had, as I mentioned, a community development and knowledge exchange in Botswana. A lot of rangers from the Kimberley region of Northern Australia went to Botswana back in May. We're also undertaking an exchange program to try and get some PhD students to Charles Darwin University in the Northern Territory so that they can take that knowledge back to Botswana and really embed it in local institutions. And also we're continuing our work with the International Savanna Fire Management Initiative Network, which really aims to draw on the expertise of people as diverse as social scientists, policymakers, people from international organisations, scientists, satellite experts. You can see that so many elements are needed for a project of this kind that it has to be truly a joint effort, which I think makes this initiative both kind of, yes, complicated in some senses, but also very feasible once you get the right expertise around the table. Here's just a couple of pictures before I end and hand over to Jeremy. This on the left, you see some burning in Botswana. This was, I think, as part of a demonstration at a Botswana fire conference. And then on this is more the traditional current way, if I'm not correct, of the Botswanan regime is really based on fire suppression and the use of ineffective fire breaks at the moment. So this is the old model on the left. And then on the right you have a couple of sand elders together with one of the senior indigenous rangers from the Kimberley sharing their fire knowledge there. So that's what we hope the future to be. Here's a couple of other pictures that we took recently in the Cedillo Hills. This is one of the sand elders walking the land, and then on the right you have a picture of a woman with her two children as a representation that these exchanges were really, all of the community was present, from the smallest to the oldest, both genders in the community. And fire management traditionally was a very important community activity. For women it was also very important from the point of view of their role in ensuring food security, because fire has a great impact on the availability of essential crops and also supplementary foods like nuts and seeds and all the rest. So women had a very strong role in these community exchanges, and we would see them having a very strong role in the future in all sorts of different capacities. And of course for children it's also a great way of developing pride in their culture, in seeing that it's actually recognised by the global community. They're in line with many indigenous communities around the world. The Sand people have been marginalised and to some extent despised by the mainstream population. And as we've seen in the north of Australia, that's not uniquely a Botswanan problem. It's also been apparent in the north of Australia that the recognition of the indigenous community knowledge as globally important scientific knowledge is also key to this project. And I recall, as Anya might also, visiting the communities in West Arnhem Land, and the sense of pride and seeing themselves as experts and people with a future was palpable there. And if you go back to, I think, to one of the slides that I showed you earlier of this guy here, this Ray is a young person from West Arnhem Land, whose grandfather was a very important elder and cultural historian and artist in that part of the world. And this is his grandson, who's very active in the welfare project. That man has been able to stay on his traditional land and have children there who are being educated in the community, and is an articulate spokesman for this project alongside many of the other people in that community. So along with many other Indigenous people, Ray's story illustrates the power of this approach, not only for individual people but also as a contribution to global emission savings and global goals for biodiversity. Our next steps is, I'll just move on to finalise that, is to do further readiness work in other countries in Southern Africa. Also, we're examining the feasibility of this approach in South America and in Asia. In the long term, it would be ideal to have a number of different pilot projects across the different regions. So our work is looking in a long-term picture towards that goal. So thank you for participating in this today. It's great to have the opportunity to share what we've been doing, because we believe it's really important. And there are a couple of great videos that we've produced that really bring this issue to life. And although I wasn't able to show it today, I've given Peter the links, which anybody can look at. It just needs 10 minutes of your time maximum, but I think it will really show you how dynamic this is in the field. So with that, I'll hand over to Jeremy, or ask any questions while Jeremy sets up his presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. Just while we switch presentations, if there's any questions in the network, and as Catherine mentioned, she sent the links to those videos, so we'll make sure that they're circulated around the network.
I have a question. The wildfire experience, my understanding, was primarily on changing the seasonality of fire. I mean, if you boil it down to a single sentence. If that's true, these other places, do they have the same seasonality issue?
David, I'll
answer your question. My name's Jeremy Russel-Smith. I'm going to give the next presentation. Yep, it is largely true. It's about changing the seasonality, but that really means you're changing the whole intensity of the fire regime. You're also addressing issues of much more patchy fires early in the dry season, less consumption of fuels. So yes, it is seasonality driven, and as we'll illustrate with Botswana and many parts around the world where under the European colonial influence fire regimes were totally suppressed, have gone to basically late dry season fire regimes, and Botswana is totally dominated by late dry season fires, as is most of southern Africa. But so you could say that changing the seasonality does help markedly address the problem.
My name is Anja Hoffmann. I've been working the last 22 years now in the issue of fire management on the various continents, mainly for international development cooperation projects in Indonesia, Southern and Eastern Africa and Brazil. That's where the connection also comes from, or with is International Savanna Fire Management Initiative, because the exchange between the Brazilian authorities, mainly IBAMA and ISFMI was initiated by a GIZ project. They're carrying out a fire management program in the Cerrado and the Big Savanna region. And I've been also partly involved in this project, doing together with Robin Beattie in the initial scoping mission on the Botswana fact-finding mission. So, and I'm also a member of the GovC Fire IT implementation team, and basically that brings me today here to this meeting.
You mentioned, Catherine, phase 1, phase 2. What's the schedule for phase 3, and is that going ahead? That's after 2021?
Yeah, so we have the first phase was funded by the Australian Government's aid program, as well as the second phase, which is due to conclude in 2021. So after 2021, we need to find follow-on funding for future pilot projects. For that, we're looking again to the Australian Government, but also other funding streams, various options, but it does require, I would say, we're looking at to really secure the project. The on-the-ground activities really have to take place over between an additional 5 to 10 year program to really get communities to the point where they're confident and have the capacity to continue on their own.
My name is Peter Jacklin. I've been managing our MRV, which is called the North Australia and Rangelands Fire Information Service. We set this up in 2002 and I've been managing it since then, so quite some time. And today I just want to explain how this MRV system works in Northern Australia, and to explain why we think it's been quite successful in doing this, and then to draw out some lessons that could be perhaps applied in the broader international context for MRVs. So to start, I'll just outline the data. So this MRV essentially runs a fire scar map or burnt area mapping, which is the core data set that we use to measure the emissions. That's based on MODIS and VERS sensors, 250 metre pixels it produces, and that's obviously satellite information. We supplement that with hotspot data based similarly on MODIS and VERS sensors, complemented by some AVH-RR satellite imagery-based hotspots, together with background maps sourced from Geoscience Australia and Google satellite imagery, which people can also view as a background. Now, the way that the fire scar mapping is processed, the way it is presented and delivered, has all been refined by working with the people on the ground who will actually have to use this information. And we've been doing this, working with users for many years now, and so we've gradually refined the system. This is the scope of our MRV at the moment, and it's, I'll just see, it's essentially, as you can see, it now covers most of northern Australia, which is almost 4 million square kilometres. But we started the system in northern Australia. This shows you the live hotspots on the site for the last couple of days. A lot of people will be using this site at the moment. And it focuses on the open areas where the satellite imagery, the satellite mapping works. And so we're talking about large areas of inland Australia plus the tropical north. It's very targeted at people who need to manage fires, the fire managers themselves. And so we're talking about indigenous ranger groups, we're talking about pastoralists as well as conservation managers. A relatively small number of people spread out over a very large area. And so that means that our MRV needs to be usable with low bandwidth, and also it needs to be quite clear and simple. It has to have a clear and simple interface because these people are very busy. They can't afford to spend a lot of time interrogating a complicated interface. So here is the basic map that these people are using, and this is the default site that this is the default display that you will get if you enter the NAFI web portal. And what it shows, you can see there in the middle, there are these are hotspots of active fires. The cooler colours, the blue spots represent hotspots that are about a week old, and then you can see the red hotspots are on the edge. This is a fire front, they're only a few hours old. This is a fire that is moving up to the northeast. As you can see, the coloured patches are burnt areas, fire scars. They're only recent fire scars. What they're doing is showing you the level of fuels that are around that fire. The cooler green colours are burnt in the early part of the year. You can see just down the bottom there's a warmer colour that's burnt later in the year. And what people can do from this is they can get an idea of where that fire is likely to go. It's got fuel that hasn't been burnt recently in front of it to the northeast. It'll probably not move into those fire scars very quickly. So this map here gives you straight away a very clear picture of where that fire is likely to go and informs people about what they might want to do to stop it. And this is operational fire management, but this forms the basis of a successful MRV for emissions, as I'll explain. The other thing these people need to help manage fire is a detailed background map. So this is another option we've developed, and these are topographic maps, but they have place names, they have river names, they have names of locations that allow people to orient themselves, to figure out where that fire is so they can explain to other people where to go. Similarly, we developed tools that allow people to check out the movement of that fire. You can circulate you can identify the area of the fire, and you can create a little mini movie based on the hotspot times of how that fire is travelling. It turns out that particular fire is travelling particularly quickly up a creek line, and that's going to help you as well in responding to that fire. And finally, and this is quite important for emissions measurement, people wanted a fire history that gives you much more detailed information on fuel. This is a 4-year fire history of the area around that fire. It's showing you how recently the fuel was burnt around the fire. And this is very important for planning your fire management, whether it's tackling a fire in the current few hours, or whether it's planning a whole season of fire management, for example, your prescribed burning can be planned with the help of these fire history maps. And we've just been disconnected. I'll just click that. I know. Okay. And finally, and is this going? I'll just move down here. Here we go. Yep. And finally, people wanted reports, and this of course reporting is very important for. Oh, okay. So, rejoining the story, the other thing that people wanted was reports, because now that we had this an accurate fire history, you could then analyse that fire history and generate reports. And people managing fire were often paid by a funding body to achieve certain goals in their fire management, and if you had a fire history, you could analyse whether they were, for example, reducing the destructive late dry season fires, and they could measure whether they were achieving their goals. So this reporting was very useful for people who need to report to their funding bodies, for example. So you could see that the operational fire management was setting up all of the framework that you need for monitoring, reporting and verification for an emissions system. And the emission abatement program arrived in 2012 in Northern Australia. So I'll just, skip back to this. So this is the zone that the abatement projects operate in. It's in far northern Australia, and it's defined by rainfall gradients. And you can see the map you're looking in the background there, that is the fire history we already had from working with operational fire managers. And so we didn't have to do an awful lot to, we just had to map a small extra amount of in the south east there, but we already had a lot of things set up once the emission abatement project started. For example, we already had a fire mapping process, we already had fire histories, and I'll just get back to where I was. And we also knew that we developed a system that we knew produced uniformly accurate fire scar mapping, which is required for your reporting. And this turns out in Australia what we needed was a manually edited automated fire scar mapping process. And that was because the automated mapping, even the latest automated mapping, tends to miss scars that have a lot of cloud cover. And that's what we had in the far eastern section of the methodology zone. This may not apply in other countries which have more suitable landscapes. For example, in the Northern Territory, the latest automated mapping seems to be quite good. But nevertheless, we needed to manually edit the mapping. And this then produced the uniformly accurate product that we needed for measuring emissions. We also then had to independently validate this mapping, and that was done using aerial surveys, using helicopters, for example, and that's a crucially important step as far as verification goes. And of course, we then worked with the government. This needed to be suitable for national and project scale greenhouse gas emissions accounting, and working with the government, we developed a tool that did this, that took in the verified fire scar mapping as well as the verified vegetation mapping, and it quickly produced a report for example, a given project that showed the emissions they were abating and the carbon credits that they were generating. The other thing we also had was engaged users. The NAFI process and the NAFI system was widely adopted right across the methodology zone from this operational tool. So when the abatement project started, we already had everybody who was going to become a potential project, they were already engaged with the NAFI system. So we're talking pastoralists, indigenous rangers and conservation managers. And NAFI really is, in these communities, almost everybody involved or who could potentially be involved in an emissions abatement project was already using NAFI. And so they were familiar with the fire scar mapping and they trusted the fire scar mapping because they could see the maps, the fire scar maps, sort of growing as the hotspots spread, and they could verify that with their own eyes on their own country. So I think that was a very important thing that held us in good stead once the emissions abatement project started, was that the mapping that was then to be used on the basis of what their incomes would be, they already trusted. And of course, we already had a user-tested tool that would help them actually achieve the emission reduction through fire management. And in the 6 or 7 years, I'll just get back to that picture. In the 6 or 7 years since 2012, as you've already heard, that project has been quite successful. We're covering a very large part of far northern Australia now, and as we've heard, we've almost got 80 savanna burning projects. They generate over 1 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent abatement every year, and they're earning over $20 million a year. And these numbers will only go up as new methodologies are rolled out, because we're only at the moment accounting for nitrous oxide and methane. We haven't yet got a system that accounts for the CO2 emissions that are being reduced. So those numbers are going to go up with new methodologies. And $20 million a year is not much, but remember we're talking about remote communities who haven't been able to have an income like that. And so, as you've heard, this is transforming these communities. So the lessons, I think, that we've learned anyway, and that may be applicable more broadly, are that trust is very important. I mean, the MRV, you need to be able, it needs to be measurable, reportable, verifiable, but it also needs to be trusted. You could have a system that was very accurate, but if the people you're dealing with are from cultures that are quite different from the sort of people who are setting these systems like us, who come from universities. And our experience is that distrust is quite easy to grow, particularly if you're not working with those end users. So in that case, you need to employ people who have the technical ability to generate the fire scars, to do the fire scar mapping, to work with the platform, but they need to effectively interact with end users. And that helps build that trust. If there's something goes wrong with the system, they need to be able to contact you and you can fix it up. And there'll always be bugs. You might have problems with a mapping update that wasn't quite right because some fire scars were missed. People can contact you, hey, there's a problem, you can then fix it up. And that people then feel empowered that they've got some control over the system. And you need to deploy user-tested and appropriate technology. For example, a lot of these countries, like Botswana, mobile phones are going to be the predominant way people will access information. So these systems need to be able to work, for example, easily on a mobile phone on a small screen. And this is it's not cheap, it's not a hugely expensive undertaking, but it does require significant ongoing investment. And the ongoing part we found is the difficult one. People often will give you money to kickstart a project, but these projects need to continue for many years, and you need support for end users as well to use it. You need some training for end users, and you need usually your national governments involved in this. This is a national greenhouse gas reporting framework involving the federal government, for example, in Australia, and so their ongoing commitment is also required, and that can be challenging. Quite often we found that some of these things just don't cost enough money. Some people don't get out of their chairs if it's less than $50 million. So you always have to be working with your end users and with your government representatives. So that's been one of our biggest challenges. And yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Peter. Apologies to everybody for the technical aspects. We'll grow into these things, I suppose, Ewald, as we get more. One thing you mentioned, Peter, that is interesting is that the continuation of support. It's one thing to get a tranche of funding that allows you to set something up and work through the steps, the first, design the process, crank the handle once. What were the difficulties about being able to continually crank the handle into the foreseeable future?
Well, these are projects that generate a lot of public good, and so it's cross-jurisdictional. So one thing we struggled with is getting funding from individual states, for example, because no individual state would put in a contribution unless all the other states that were using the fund also contributed. And so it ended up, and the overheads of liaising with all the different states that were covered by the system was too great. So national funding was therefore the way to go. And the problem we had there was that this is natural resource management. Natural resource management is a very low priority for national funding in Australia. And we found it also, there were difficulties because of the churn you get in staff in some of these departments. I mean, some of these staff we were dealing with were only around for 6 months. And then new staff came in, and this is a sort of not an easy thing to get your head around. So there's some of the problem.
Okay, so there's a need for the project, which is no longer a project, to have the capacity to maintain that engagement, reconnect where necessary, keep educating, both upwards. I mean, downwards is obvious, but upwards is possibly not so obvious.
That's right, and our service is a little bit like a small fire-based version of the Bureau of Meteorology, our weather service in Australia, in that it's generating benefits for such a broad range of the community that you can't possibly get contributions from all those beneficiaries, so it really requires a national centralised fund.
I might just ask, perhaps, Peter, could you comment also on, just to give a general picture of what kind of resources it takes each year to run NAFI, how many people, how much money, and what you would see are the main challenges of having equivalent systems available to communities in other developing countries where these sorts of projects might be instituted?
Yes, it costs us around $1 million a year to run NAFI across the rangelands that you see there. And a lot of costs are involved in the fire scale mapping because we employ people to do that. But there are a lot of hidden costs. For example, we have these things sitting on servers. The servers have to be upgraded frequently, as do the databases. You have a lot of, you need to interact with users. They're in remote locations, so some travel is involved. And the data itself is, some of that requires expenditure as well. But yeah, when you add it all up, you don't get a lot of change out of $1 million a year.
I believe one of the parts of the question, if I understood, was how many beneficiaries, how many end users there are in the system.
Yes, so we get about, we have about 100,000 different computers end users, we think, using the system over the course of a year. As far as we also measure our activity with maps downloaded from the site, so there's about 7 million of those maps downloaded every year. And I guess another way of looking at it is, in a given fire management community, most, if not all, people who need to manage open country fires will be using NAFI. I guess that's the more important figure. It's the depth of penetration is very high, and it also means that you need to cooperate in fire management, often involving groups who are completely different, pastoralists, indigenous rangers, and having a common, it's like a lingua franca for fire management. They're all looking at the same maps. They all know what the different colours mean, and so it makes it much easier to cooperate and communicate. And if most users are using, or if not all users and fire managers are using the same NAFI system, then that's a real advantage. But the beneficiaries, of course, are much broader than that, and they include the general public, the global public.
Thank you, Peter. Is there any other questions? I think that what you just mentioned about a common point of reference is really important. So the whole idea of the fire management dashboard that I've been rabbiting on about a bit for a while and talking to Luigi and David about is about having that sort of common reference so that everybody in a given country is actually starting from the same data set and transformed or manipulated in the same way, and you avoid interactions that can be negative about whose data it is and how it was worked on and where it came from and those sorts of things.
And I'm just going to introduce some of the science basis of this. I'm going to really focus mostly on the Australian experience, even though it's been covered to some extent both by Catherine and Peter, because I think that's quite important to give that sort of background. And actually that image of the smoky, hazy savanna, that could probably be almost anywhere on planet Earth. It happens to be in North Queensland, Australia. And just to remind us that 62% of global fire emissions come from savannas. So despite big problems that occur in the Arctic and Amazonia and peatlands every now and again, on average over the years, the estimate is that the majority of emissions come from savanna landscapes. Just to put this in geographical climatic context, there's the steep rainfall gradient in Northern Australia, about 1,500, 2,000 millimetres mean annual rainfall in the north, down to the yellows and oranges there, it's about 500 millimetres. And the emissions abatement program I'm going to be describing really fits in that envelope above the reds. And in that envelope, fires can occur on an annual basis, despite rainfall variability increasing as you go south. You do get fires recurring on an annual basis in that landscape. That's the contemporary cadastre for Northern Australia. Very large properties in the main, in the western side there, the centre and the north. Big pastoral properties in the main, and then in the eastern side, as you're going southwards, you run into very fertile soils, and it's quite densely occupied with beef cattle and sheep production. But in the north, it's extensive rangeland areas, and what the animals don't eat, the fires do. This is the growing indigenous cadastre, and if you go back to, say, 1975, probably only a couple of % of that whole area would have been indigenous legal land. It's been a very remarkable transformation, really fought through the courts by indigenous people to get their land back, and the majority of land in Northern Australia is now Aboriginal land, a very remarkable achievement. And that's the national fire regime situation. The fires are predominantly in the north and the savannas, sometimes in central Australia, in the semi-arid rangelands and very scarcely in the deep south areas, although if you were to believe the global media, all the fires were to occur in southern Australia. And in 2002, 2003, the one that's right down in the southeast corner was a very extensive fire. There was about 20,000 square kilometres, but it's a very rare event. The fires that do get reported in the media in southern Australia, typically, a few hundred hectares, sometimes a few square kilometres, burn houses, kill people, but at a global scale they are not particularly significant. The real problem though is the seasonality of the regime, and that's using mode symmetry back to 2011. A lot of the types of savanna burning projects we're describing now have really taken off since that time, but you can see that very predominantly in the east, that's called Cape York Peninsula, very substantial late dry season fire problem, and about 2/3 of all fires in the north up to that time were late dry season fires. So getting to a methodology, an early dry season patchy fire regime means that you take into account a patchiness factor. You take into account the fact that a lot of the fuels are not actually consumed, and certainly the smoky emissions are not much by comparison with a late dry season fire regime, where typically late dry season fires in northern Australia on average are well over 1,000 kilometres squared in extent, getting up to 50,000 square kilometres in extent, very substantial fires. That bottom right-hand picture is in the World Heritage National Park, and that tract of landscape gets burnt by fires like that every couple of years. It doesn't do much for habitat diversity. Those are eucalypts. They will, in the main, resprout and regenerate. They don't necessarily die. Eucalypts are very resilient creatures, but very substantial emissions result from them. Catherine's already shown that, and I won't go through it, but it's actually a very simple product equation where you take into account all these different sort of parameters for a different fuel vegetation type, take into the account patchiness, fuel consumption in different fuel loads, seasonality of fires, emission factors, which is probably the most complicated matter to determine, but in fact, as many of you will be aware, the emission factors for methane and nitrous oxide globally are pretty consistent on whatever savanna you're dealing with, and that's been our experience in Northern Australia. So you've got a big Excel calculation to do, and while there are a lot of parameters, it's actually just a matter of spending some years getting the hard work done, and it's a pretty straightforward process. This is an emissions abatement methodology. I'll come to other types of methodologies in a minute. So back in the early 2000s, we were really kick-started by a global corporate energy company that wanted to set up a liquefied natural gas plant in our region, and they were required to offset, and they actually started to contract Aboriginal landowners in that panel on the right, and it's called the WAFMA area. It was the Western Arnhem Land Fire Management Agreement area, and it's contiguous with two national parks to the west, the green colours. And in 2006, that company signed a 17-year contract with Aboriginal landowners to deliver 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year, and it has worked fantastically ever since. And on that basis, as has been mentioned, in 2012 we had started a national program for savanna burning. It's actually an accountable activity under the Kyoto Protocol, and we've started to grow a lot of projects across the north. So this is that Western Armland project in the present day. It now covers an area which is about, is it 40,000 square kilometres? 80,000 square kilometres? 80. It's grown in size, involves a lot of ranger groups, a lot of communities across the north. They have annual meetings twice a year, the pre-fire season planning and the end of season account exercise, and those projects are working fantastically, not just reducing emissions accounting, but each of those ranger groups has its own set of cultural KPIs that they're working to, and they're actually meeting many of them. It's about intergenerational connections between old people and young people, getting young people out on country jobs, health benefits, looking after cultural sites and the main. So it's actually working at a whole lot of social, cultural levels. And I think it would be fair to say that not many of those people really care much about the emissions side of it. That's been the means to the end. So this schematic basically shows that on the left hand side, the greenhouse gas emissions, methane, nitrous oxide, that's the current methodology that we've been using. We have been looking at the non-living biomass carbon component. That is actually incorporated within the latest national methodology for savanna burning. But the big one is actually the living tree biomass method, and that's something which will be probably in place in the next couple of years. And for every carbon credit or tonne of CO2 equivalent abated under the current emissions abatement project, our estimates would be that it'd be an order of magnitude of credits that will be generated under the sequestration methodology. So we suddenly go from an economically significant but almost boutique economic activity across the north to one which becomes a very major economic activity, which actually is equivalent to the regional pastoral industry. So we suddenly look at transforming the whole economy of Northern Australia through these types of projects. Missing from that set of methodologies is soil carbon. And while we recognise that in some savanna landscapes there is clearly a connection between reducing emissions from late dry season fires and incorporation of carbon into the soil organic component, in Northern Australian infertile savannas we have not been able to demonstrate that there is any linkage at all, so we don't include or envisage a soil carbon methodology into the near future, which is actually quite a significant finding in its own right. So the three different colours there, so the light green one, which goes to the most southerly extent, is what we would define as our tropical savannas on a sort of biogeographic type of framework. The sort of olive green is, and the dark green are the sort of the two areas where our emissions abatement methodologies work. And there is interest in the rangelands further south, but that's a long journey to go. And as of 2016, that's a 1.2 million square kilometre area. There's 25% of Northern Australia at that time was then under a Savanna burning project. So it's been a very remarkable take-up of this methodology since 2012. I've only put those 2 books there because under the rules that the IPCC and others set, we have to publish all these methodologies in peer-reviewed publications, and that's why all that work has been put into those. Moving to the Botswana pilot study, that's the modus fire frequency for the country. Right in the north, the Botswana rainfall will be about 650 millimetres, and then as you go southwards, it's down to about 300. Our 2 pilot studies that we're working on at the present time are both in the northeast and northwest, the most fire-prone areas, and though there is interest in one in the more central part, the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, we'd like to try to get the methodologies worked out for the more prospective areas to start with. I think this is a diagram from Luigi, and it just shows the seasonality of the current fire regime. Is totally late dry season dominated in Botswana, and that is a direct result of the colonial and now the Botswana government's fire suppression policy. It's not very helpful. There's no attempt in support for the current policy to undertake prescribed mitigating fire management activities in the early dry season. And so that's going to be quite a big challenge that we face to get that changed. But in our discussions over the past year with relevant parties, people do clearly understand that change is going to be required. So we've been working in this World Heritage area around the Cedillo Hills site, fantastic history of rock art and occupation going back 100,000 years. And they have contrary to the experience of much of Botswana, they actually have a pretty useful fire management strategy which actually includes the undertaking of prescribed burning. It's not all about fire suppression and just using braided fire breaks and the like in a vain attempt to contain fires. So working with that community, we've been undertaking a fair bit of prescribed burning training. A lot of the sort of PPE equipment there was provided by the Australian New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and a lot of training in how to put out a fire. But more importantly, it's been important to try to get people to understand how we can safely go about implementing prescribed burning in the early dry season. And that's involved lots of women who have in fact been the main firelighters in these activities, and it's been a very successful social exercise. Here's a recent Landsat image. The Cedillo Hills areas right up there in the north east. You can see the sort of the parallel dune systems and the intervening swales. It almost has an annual fire history because it's a fire suppression policy. Nobody goes out and really uses the breaks in the landscape currently. In fact, it's illegal to do so, despite a long cultural tradition, particularly by San people, of burning in a very similar manner to Aboriginal people in Northern Australia. Lots of early dry season fires, breaking up the country for hunting and other sort of cultural purposes. And the there's a very active fire there just from the last few days and the hot spots involved. And the purpose of illustrating this schematic here is that while all this information is readily available, it was downloadable in situ with very poor bandwidth, the National Department of Forestry and Range Resources, they just don't have ready access to all this information. And it's going to be quite a challenge to revive these Southern African networks to get that sort of information actually being used. So it's available, but it's not being utilised by the powers that be, even though it's all there. This sort of final slide is simply to say that from a methodological point of view, we think that after a year's looking at it, that it would be readily achievable to develop an analogous emissions abatement methodology to that in Northern Australia. There's a few tweaks in it. There's a lot more shrubs in those landscapes than in North Australian savannas with a lot more grassy fuels. But a lot of the shrubs are deciduous in the late dry season, so you get a much greater fuel load in the late dry season. If you were to encourage burning more in the early dry season, you'd be burning under lower fuel loads, for example. So we really do think that a methodology is quite achievable, but it's not the technical challenges that's going to be really difficult here. It's supporting the local communities, building market-based approaches, governance arrangements, changing national policies, developing the national and international MRV type systems in that part of the world. All achievable, but it's going to require a concerted effort, which is not just going to require just Botswana doing it. It's going to need a collective effort. And I think, as we're all aware, the great savanna fire problem is Africa. So it's pretty much incumbent on us to put a bit of effort into that activity. So that's that presentation over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think one of the things that's come through all three of the presentations is this emphasis on the community, the indigenous knowledge, the traditional knowledge, and having to engage with that, which is part of the maintenance question that I asked Peter before, which is how do you keep that level of engagement maintained? Everybody's often enthusiastic to start that sort of thing, but then to keep it routinely turning over, and I guess we're talking potentially decades of activity in these cases. So, does anybody have any questions? Anya, you're an insider. You can't have. You're an insider. You're not supposed to have questions. Go on. What would you like? Just click that. Yeah.
Perhaps not a question, but rather a comment, because you were saying they don't have access to the data, which I would say not necessarily true. They do have access to the data, but they are not using it. Yeah.
I think our very recent experience would actually challenge your comment that, in fact, they're very keen to be able to use the data, but the institutional capability and support for technically capable people is not there.
Yeah, and this is one of the key challenges. I mean, as you are aware, I've been living there and working with them for many years, and I think Botswana is no exception, many other countries. It is, the real challenge is the institutional and manage human side and the management systems of these institutions. I mean, in the past there have been people that were capable to do the job, but they are not there anymore. So, and And that comes back to what Peter was just saying. Often you are quite enthusiastic, and in the initial part, things are going, but I think we fail to maintain or build a capacity within a government system to go on in the long run. And this is the real challenge, and this costs a lot of time and a lot of efforts. Yeah. And I think you all know that. Yeah.
Thank you, Anya. Any other questions from the room? We've just
I've got a question. So the emissions abatement that you're currently doing is for methane and nitrous oxide, but not CO2, right?
Yes.
Why is the CO2 going to come in or not? And would that be part of a
It could
future?
be, but
I mean, why is that? I'm just curious.
the IPCC believes that what gets burnt in one burning season gets fixed in the vegetation in the next. And now that's not necessarily true. And besides, CO2 is out there for a damn long time before it does get fixed in the vegetation. So it is feasible to account for, but it's been just put into the too hard basket.
a completely live question.
So in terms of the doing this in Africa, who do you envisage would pay for the carbon offset, the carbon credits like you have in Australia, 20 million a year, I heard from Peter. How would that work? How do you envision that working in Africa?
Well, I think there's actually quite an appetite, particularly in European context, to buy offsets, credible, accredited offsets, and I think that's where we would be wanting to go in the first place, to actually build those markets. And that's the same as applies to Australia. We don't want to just be stuck in a government regulated system. We already have a pretty active voluntary system, but as the CDM and other sort of mechanisms open up, there can be global markets in this sort of space.
With respect to the Walfer project, ConocoPhillips buy-in, that was 17 years, you said. Are they going to continue that? Or
Yep. And they're very interested in expanding, and so they've actually been supporting us financially to develop the next round of sequestration methodologies. They're very interested, and they've been
so
quite
that's a good example then of the kind of thing that you were talking about then, if it was applied in Africa, because those kind of industries work in Africa as well, obviously.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to belittle the challenge of getting those markets in place, but that's really where we
you
need
use
to go.
the word there's an appetite. I think that's correct.
Yeah.
The Botswana government has also said they have made emissions commitments that they don't know how they're going to meet as well. So there is opportunity within the government framework in Botswana, because they've actually said they're going to reduce emissions somehow, but they don't know where.
Just another dimension of that issue, just to let you know that one of the other tasks that we have is to get these projects accredited in voluntary market standards like the gold standard in the VCS, so that we can also measure the co-benefits, the social benefits that these projects generate, so that they're more attractive in the voluntary carbon market as co-benefit projects also. So that's another task that I really should have added to that list on the slide of all the tasks that need to be done.
There were quite a few there already, Catherine, I think, and the first 4 or 5 were the critical ones about engagement with Indigenous people. Thank you very much to all our presenters, and thank you for those who've checked in. Apologies once again for the various technical hiccups and things. We'll keep, Tony and I will have a chat about that later this week and see if we can make this a bit smoother, because there's always been some sort of an issue. So thanks to our speakers, to Catherine, to Peter and to Jeremy, and look forward to hearing other questions and other inputs from colleagues throughout the Forest Technical Network in the future. Thank you.